My name is Thea Anders, and I was 28 years old the afternoon I drove 4 hours to my childhood home in Marietta, Ohio, and watched the lawyer read my name off a list as if it were something that needed to be crossed out. I had been told we were gathering to discuss my grandmother Ruth's estate together as a family. I was the only person in that room who believed that was actually why we were there. Marietta is a kind of small Ohio town where your family name follows you into every conversation, whether you invited it or not. The Anders family had been there since the 1940s, and my grandmother Ruth had built something real from almost nothing. The house on Putnam Street was her life's work, a large, beautiful old building she had restored piece by piece in the early 80s. It had a staircase made from old-growth pine, windows that were more than a century old, and a wide porch that made a particular creaking sound I had known since I was small enough to think that sound meant safety. I hadn't lived there in 6 years, but every time I walked to the door it smelled the same, with polish, old timber, and something warm and sweet I could never quite name. That smell was the first thing I noticed when I arrived that October afternoon. I parked behind my sister Lauren's new SUV. The driveway had been freshly paved, which seemed like an odd detail to notice, but those are the details your mind holds onto when the larger thing is too large to absorb all at once. Inside, the dining room table had been arranged to look like a business meeting. Folders, glasses of water, printed documents at every seat. My father, Roger, stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the lawn. My mother, Diane, sat at the head of the table, which was unusual because that had always been my grandmother's seat. The family lawyer, Mr. Kimball, was already there with a thick envelope. Lauren was looking at her phone with her legs crossed and didn't look up when I came in. My mother didn't say hello. She told me to sit down. Mr. Kimball read through the news in a flat, even voice. He described the house, the rental cottages, the family furniture store, the land, and the bank accounts. Together it came to nearly $4 million. Everything Ruth had built and everything my father had grown over the decades that followed. Every item went to Lauren. My portion appeared on its own line near the bottom. $1. There was a clause beneath it stating that any legal challenge to the will would result in forfeiting even that. Lauren didn't move. She had the stillness of someone who already knew the ending. My mother sat straight in my grandmother's chair and looked at me over her glasses with a smile that had been prepared in advance. She said that she and my father had discussed it carefully and that they both agreed. Then she said I had always been their biggest disappointment. The room went so quiet I could hear a high, thin ringing in my ears. I put my hands on the edge of the chair and held on. My father continued looking at the window. Mr. Kimball closed his folder. Lauren stood up, ready to leave. I sat there with my hands on that old pine and a $1 check in front of me, trying to understand how long my sister had known before I walked through the door. My mother had a list of explanations. She said I had abandoned the family path. Ruth had built the store, my father had expanded it, and Lauren had married well and stayed nearby. But I had left to do decorating, and she said the word as though it were something a bored teenager does on a Saturday afternoon. I wanted to tell her that I had a professional degree, that I managed large budgets and complex projects, that I had not once in my adult life missed a bill or borrowed money from them or asked for anything at all. But she was not listening. She told me people in town were talking. She said she had heard I was in debt, that I had lost clients, that I was unstable. That last word felt like something thrown directly at my face. None of it was true, not one piece of it. I had never been sued, never been fired, never been in financial trouble. As I sat there listening to her list every flaw in this version of me that bore my name, I kept looking at Lauren. She was pouring herself a glass of water. She looked completely comfortable. And I began to understand that someone had spent a significant amount of time and effort building a false version of me in my parents' minds, and that person had been at the table before I arrived. Over the following weeks, things I had not previously connected began to form a pattern. My mother mentioned a family friend who claimed I had asked for a loan I never requested. She mentioned a neighbor who said I was struggling, and that neighbor was someone Lauren saw regularly. My cousin Megan, who kept in touch with me quietly over the years, told me about a family gathering I had missed where Lauren had stood holding her tea and told everyone that I couldn't even keep a houseplant alive. The room had laughed. It seemed small and dismissible, but it was not small. It was one thread in a long piece of work Lauren had been doing for at least 2 years, a slow accumulation of tiny stories and soft sighs and secondhand rumors, until the people who raised me were no longer thinking about their actual daughter. They were thinking about the character Lauren had invented. There was one thing in the will that did not go to Lauren. My grandmother had specifically left me a small cedar box. I had seen it on her dresser my entire childhood, but had never opened it. My mother handed it to me at the end of the meeting with the attitude of someone offering a consolation prize. Lauren looked at it and said it seemed about right. I took the box and left. It was light and smelled like my grandmother's room, like the lavender sachets she kept in her sewing table. I didn't open it in that house, in front of those people. I couldn't. I spent that night in a cheap motel down the road and thought through my options with the methodical calm that arrives after the initial shock has passed. I could hire a lawyer and argue that my sister had manipulated my parents through deliberate lies, but I knew what that would look like from the outside. It would cost years and money I didn't have, and even if I prevailed, the people in that town who had been fed Lauren's version of me would simply see it as confirmation that I was, as my mother said, unstable. I would be suing my own family. It would prove nothing except the story she had already written. So I chose differently. I decided I would not fight for a seat at a table where I had been told, plainly and in front of a lawyer, that I was worth $1. I would go somewhere no one had already decided who I was, and I would build something from the beginning. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina. A friend had mentioned it in passing once, that the city had beautiful old houses and steady work for someone who understood historic preservation and design. More importantly, no one there knew my name or the stories attached to it. I gave my landlord notice, sold my furniture for $1,100, packed my clothes and my laptop and my grandmother's cedar box into my car, and left at 6 a.m. I watched my old city disappear in the rearview mirror. I had roughly $3,000, no apartment waiting and no job arranged. I found a room above a shop for $600 a month. It had one window. The first night, I set the cedar box on the windowsill and sat in the dark. I almost opened it, but I stopped. Opening it felt like the last step of something, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I took a job at a furniture store for $12 an hour, moving pieces in the morning and spending my afternoons building a portfolio and sending cold inquiries to real estate agents. Most people said no. I ate rice and beans most evenings and washed my hair with hand soap because shampoo felt like an expense I couldn't justify. I kept a running list of every dollar that came in and went out. I was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of being right about me. The turning point came when a woman named Deborah gave me the chance to stage a house that had sat unsold for 3 months. When I finished, she walked through it and said, "You see space differently." It was the first time in a long time someone had looked at my work and seen something valuable in it rather than something lacking. Shortly after, I met Nathan, a builder who specialized in historic renovation. He looked at my drawings and recognized that I understood how to honor a structure while making it livable. He asked if I wanted to work together. I was not accustomed to being asked for something, so it took me a moment to say yes. We named the company Lark Design. Nathan said larkspurs look fragile, but have roots strong enough to crack concrete. That felt like the right idea to build something around. Our first significant project was a house built in 1924. When we pulled up the old carpet in the front hall, we found a pine staircase underneath that had been covered over for decades. It looked almost exactly like the staircase of my grandmother's house on Putnam Street. I stood there for a moment and understood something I had not let myself think clearly before. Every old house I chose to work on was a version of the home I had been removed from. I was saving them because I knew what it meant for something solid and carefully built to be discarded. We brought that job in under budget. The owner cried when she saw it finished. I didn't cry. I took a photograph and felt something settle quietly in my chest. I finally opened the cedar box that night. Inside were 3 things: my grandmother's old brass measuring tape, the original hand-drawn floor plans for the house on Putnam Street, and a letter written in her handwriting. She wrote that she had watched my mother favor Lauren for years, and that she had known about the lies Lauren told. She wrote that people would call me a disappointment, and that this was simply what some people called someone who refused to be managed. She told me not to let her house become a stranger's. She had left me the plans because she wanted me to remember exactly what it was supposed to look like. I began carrying her brass measuring tape on every job. It fit in my coat pocket and weighed almost nothing, but I was aware of it every day. Lark Design grew steadily over the next 2 years. We were not wealthy, but we were trusted, and trust in that industry travels farther than money. We were called in from other states. A national design publication ran a feature on one of our restorations. My cousin Megan told me my mother had seen the article and said that being in a magazine didn't mean you were successful. I noted that and moved on. Then the news from Marietta began to change. Lauren had not been careful with the estate. She closed a furniture store and lost a significant amount of money on a business venture that failed. She had borrowed heavily against the house and the rental properties and could no longer service the debt. The house on Putnam Street was going into foreclosure. A developer had made an offer. The plan was to tear it down and build apartments. I unrolled my grandmother's floor plans on the work table in our studio and looked at them for a long time. Then I called Nathan. We structured our offer through the company, using our business name rather than my own. I did not want my family to know who was buying until it was no longer possible for them to stop it. We offered cash, which meant a clean and fast transaction, and the offer was accepted. My father did not learn who the buyer was until the day of the final walkthrough, when I came to the front door and the realtor introduced me as the principal of the purchasing company. My father was standing in the kitchen. He looked older and very tired. He stared at me and kept saying it was impossible, repeating the word as though the repetition might eventually make the situation make more sense. My mother arrived shortly after and began crying almost immediately. She said we were still family and that things could be repaired. I told her, calmly and without raising my voice, that she was the one who had sat in my grandmother's chair and told me in front of a lawyer that I was their biggest disappointment. She said it had been a mistake, that she had been misled. I did not argue with her. I simply showed her my portfolio, every house I had restored, every project completed on time and under budget, every client who had trusted me with something they valued. The work spoke clearly enough on its own. I allowed my parents to stay temporarily in the smaller guest cottage on the property while they arranged alternate housing. It was a rental agreement with a fair market rate, a business transaction, nothing more. I was not interested in performing reconciliation for an audience. Over the following 7 months, Nathan and I restored the house on Putnam Street according to the plans my grandmother had drawn by hand. We saved the pine staircase. We repaired the original windows. We restored the porch, and when we finished and I walked across it, it made exactly the sound it had made when I was a child. My parents eventually moved to a smaller house across town. Lauren relocated to find work elsewhere. My father still has difficulty explaining what happened when people ask. He uses the word impossible still, as though he is hoping someone will eventually tell him he is right. My grandmother's brass measuring tape sits on my desk. I use it on every project. It is a simple object, not valuable in any conventional sense, but reminds me daily of something she understood that my parents never did. That being removed from a list changes nothing about what you are actually capable of. It just removes an obstacle between you and the work you were always going to do. I did not save that house to prove something to my parents. I saved it because my grandmother asked me to 8 years before she died, in a letter she knew I would only find when I needed it most. She had already seen who I was. She had simply been waiting for me to see it too.